The highway stretched endlessly ahead, a ribbon of dark asphalt illuminated only by the glow of my headlights. Trees lined the sides of the road like silent sentinels, their branches barely stirring in the night breeze. I had been driving for hours, each passing mile a step closer to my parents' house and my mom's birthday celebration. The idea of her warm smile kept me going, but the night was dragging on longer than I'd expected. Fatigue settled in, heavy and familiar. The rhythmic hum of the engine and the occasional bump in the road worked against me, lulling me into a daze. I rolled down the window a bit, letting the cold air slap me awake. The night air smelled of pine and damp soil, a reminder that I was far from the city. There were no other cars in sight, no gas stations or rest stops, just me and the empty highway. The road ahead seemed endless, the kind of isolation that messes with your head if you let it. Part of me debated pulling off somewhere to catch a nap, but I knew myself too well. If I stopped now, I might not make it in time for the morning festivities. I spotted him just as I rounded a bend, a figure standing by the side of the road, his arm raised, signaling for a ride. His face was obscured by the shadows cast by the trees, but his posture seemed urgent, almost desperate. My first instinct was to drive past, to keep going and pretend I hadn't seen him. But something about the stillness of the night and the sight of that lone figure tugged at me. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was the need for some conversation to break the silence that had been weighing me down. Either way, I slowed the car and pulled over. He approached quickly, opening the passenger door before I could second-guess myself. "Thanks," he muttered as he climbed in, slamming the door shut behind him. I glanced over, trying to get a read on him. He was probably in his mid-30s, wearing a worn jacket and jeans that had seen better days. His dark eyes flickered nervously as he glanced around, like someone who was constantly on edge. "Name's Adam," he said, offering a brief smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I gave him my name in return, though it felt strange saying it out loud to a stranger in the middle of nowhere. As the car rolled forward, Adam leaned back into the seat, letting out a long sigh. "Been a rough night," he said quietly. "Figured I'd try my luck hitchhiking." I nodded, not quite knowing what to say. His presence was unsettling in a way I couldn't quite put my finger on, but I tried to brush it off. People had their reasons for being where they were. Who was I to judge? We drove in silence for a while, the hum of the engine filling the space between us. Eventually, Adam started talking again, as if he couldn't stand the quiet any more than I could. His voice was low, almost reluctant, as he began to share pieces of his story. He told me he'd been mixed up with some dangerous people, a group that didn't take betrayal lightly. "I left them," he said, staring out the window. "Had to. They would have dragged me down, sooner or later." There was no regret in his voice, just a cold certainty, like he knew exactly how things could have ended if he'd stayed. He went on, describing how they'd been after him ever since he walked away. It wasn't a matter of if they found him, but when. "They're persistent," he said with a grim chuckle, though there was no humor in it. "You leave a life like that, you don't get to walk away clean." The more he talked, the more uneasy I felt. I kept my eyes on the road, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. I told myself that this was just a story, a stranger's way of passing the time on a long drive. But part of me knew better. There was something in his voice that told me this was real. And just as I began to think about what I'd gotten myself into, the night around us shifted. It happened suddenly. A car roared past us from out of nowhere, its headlights cutting through the darkness like a blade. I barely had time to react before the car swerved sharply in front of us, forcing me to slam on the brakes. The tires screeched in protest, the car jolting as I fought to keep it on the road. My heart pounded in my chest as the other car came to an abrupt stop just a few meters ahead. The way it had maneuvered, so precise and deliberate, it was no accident. Adam sat up straighter, all traces of casualness gone from his expression. "That's them," he whispered, his voice tight with fear. I didn't wait to find out what would happen next. Instinct took over, and I yanked the wheel to the right, guiding the car off the highway and onto a dirt road that branched off into the trees. The tires skidded over the loose gravel, and the car jolted as it adjusted to the rough terrain. The headlights from the car behind us disappeared momentarily, blocked by the dense trees, but I knew they wouldn't stay lost for long. I pressed my foot harder on the gas, the engine groaning in protest as we sped down the narrow path. My eyes darted to the rearview mirror every few seconds, waiting for those headlights to reappear, and then they did. A cold wave of fear washed over me as the lights grew brighter, inching closer with every passing second. The dirt road twisted and turned, but the other car stayed with us, relentless in its pursuit. I gritted my teeth, my hands slick with sweat as I gripped the wheel. Just as I thought I might outrun them, the car hit a deep pothole with a sickening thud. The steering wheel wrenched out of my hands, and the car veered wildly to the side. Before I could regain control, we skidded off the road and crashed into a fence, the impact throwing me forward into the steering wheel. The impact left me reeling, my forehead slamming into the steering wheel. Pain shot through my skull like a hammer blow, making everything around me blur. I sat slumped over, my head pounding as if it were about to split open. For a moment, I couldn't tell where I was or what had just happened. The world outside the windshield was spinning, and it took every ounce of focus I had to keep my eyes open. Through the haze, I heard the sound of doors slamming and heavy footsteps crunching on gravel. My fingers trembled as I tried to sit up, but my body didn't respond the way I wanted it to. I turned my head slowly, catching sight of the figures approaching through the shattered windshield. Adam sat frozen beside me, his expression grim but resigned. He didn't try to run. He didn't even flinch. It was as if he'd known this moment was coming all along. The men from the other car yanked the passenger door open and dragged him out in one smooth motion. I could hear their boots scraping against the gravel, but none of them said a word. I tried to move, to speak, but the pain kept me pinned to the seat. My vision flickered like a faulty light bulb, the world around me slipping in and out of focus. All I could do was watch as they shoved Adam into the back of their car. He didn't resist. He just looked back at me once, his face strangely calm, as if to say, it was always going to end like this. And then they were gone, speeding off into the night, their taillights vanishing into the darkness. I don't know how long I sat there, slumped over the steering wheel, listening to the wind rustle through the trees. Time felt meaningless in those moments, each second dragging on endlessly as I struggled to process what had just happened. The road was silent now, as if the night itself had swallowed the chaos whole. Eventually, I forced myself to sit up. My head throbbed with every movement, and a dull ache spread across my neck and shoulders. Blood trickled from a cut on my forehead, but it was shallow, just enough to sting. I wiped it away with the back of my hand and looked around. The car was still intact, though the front bumper had crumpled against the fence. I wasn't sure if it would start, but I knew I had to try. Staying there felt dangerous, like the night wasn't quite done with me yet. With shaky hands, I turned the key in the ignition. The engine coughed once, twice, and then roared to life, sputtering slightly but functional. I had planned this hike for weeks, certain that I knew the route well enough to finish it in a day. The trail was long, yes, but I'd done longer, or so I thought. That morning I stuffed my pack with essentials, water, snacks, a flashlight, and a first aid kit. I felt ready, the adrenaline kicking in before my boots even hit the dirt. The beginning of the trail was easy enough. Wide paths winding between towering trees, the sound of birds in the canopy above. I kept a steady pace, the weight of my pack settling comfortably on my back. I breathed in the forest air, that familiar mix of pine and damp earth, and let my mind wander. As the hours passed, the trees grew thicker, and the path became narrower. The thrill of solitude took hold. I liked being alone out here, just me, the trail, and the wild. By noon, I stopped briefly to eat and check my map. Everything seemed to be going according to plan, though I noticed my legs were more tired than they should have been for the distance I'd covered. I pushed that thought aside and kept going, but a nagging voice in the back of my mind warned that I'd underestimated this trail. The sun was already leaning west by the time I realized how far I still had to go. Time always slips away faster in the woods. One moment the sky was bright, and the next it dimmed into dusk. I wasn't where I expected to be by now. I quickened my pace, but the trail only seemed to stretch farther. My water bottle was lighter than it should have been, and the trees seemed closer together, hemming me in from all sides. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I had to rely on my flashlight to see. Its beam cut a narrow tunnel through the thickening darkness, but the forest outside that beam seemed endless. Everything sounded sharper. The crunch of gravel underfoot, the wind threading through branches. I tried to focus on each step, tuning out the strange sensations of the forest closing in on me. The path twisted and coiled in ways I didn't remember from the map, and the deeper I went, the more uncertain I became. I wasn't lost, I told myself, just behind schedule. The night in the forest isn't just dark, it's heavy. The trees blocked out the moonlight, and the shadows between them seemed to move with every flick of my flashlight. I hated that feeling creeping in, the sense that I was no longer alone. The footsteps started slowly. At first, I thought it was just me, an echo or the sound of my own boots crunching dry leaves. But the rhythm wasn't right. I'd stop, and the footsteps would stop a second later. I'd take a few steps forward, and they'd start again, just far enough away that I couldn't pinpoint where they were coming from. I tried not to let the panic settle in. It had to be an animal, I told myself. Maybe a deer, curious about me. But the steps weren't light enough for that, and they didn't scatter when I stopped walking. They felt deliberate, the kind of steps someone takes when they don't want to be noticed. Then the stones began. The first one hit my shoulder, small, but just hard enough for me to feel it. I whirled around, shining my flashlight wildly into the woods. Nothing. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood there, gripping my pack straps, scanning every corner of the forest. Another stone landed by my feet. I swung the beam toward the spot where it had come from, and just as the light flickered across the tree line, I saw it. A shape, barely visible, watching me from the shadows. For a moment I couldn't move. My breath caught in my throat as the figure stayed perfectly still, just outside the reach of my flashlight. I aimed the beam straight at it, but the shape shifted slightly, staying right on the edge of darkness. It was a person. At least it looked like one. No animal moves like that. The figure tilted its head, as if curious about me, but it didn't come closer. Not yet. My legs refused to cooperate. All I could do was stare back at the figure, my flashlight trembling in my hand. Then instinct took over, and I turned sharply to get away. The ground beneath me gave out at the worst possible moment. A root caught my foot, twisting it at an awkward angle, and I hit the dirt with a hard thud. Pain shot through my ankle, sharp and immediate, and I knew instantly that I wasn't walking out of this easily. I tried to stand, but the pain forced me back down. My ankle throbbed with each attempt, and I gritted my teeth, waiting for it to pass. I hobbled over to a large rock and sat down, hoping the figure was just a trick of the light, a product of my exhaustion. But when I looked back into the woods, it was still there, standing perfectly still, watching me. Not moving, not saying anything, just there. I tried to slow my breathing, but it came out ragged and uneven. There was no way I could outrun it, not with my ankle like this. The figure stayed just far enough to make it unclear if it was a threat or simply waiting for something. Minutes stretched on like hours as I sat on that rock, pinned by the quiet tension between us. I didn't know what it wanted, or if it wanted anything at all. I don't know how long I stayed on that rock, frozen, watching the figure. Time blurred, and every second felt like an eternity. The forest was painfully quiet, as if holding its breath along with me. My flashlight flickered slightly, and I gave it a shake, the dim beam barely holding back the darkness. The figure remained just out of reach, as if it knew exactly where the light ended. I shifted my weight, trying to stretch my injured ankle. It sent sharp pain up my leg, making me suck in a breath. The figure didn't move, didn't react. It was still. That stillness gnawed at my nerves. There was no sign of threat, but no sign of peace either. I kept thinking that if it were a person, surely it would say something or step forward. But it didn't. I felt the weight of the situation pressed down on me. I couldn't stay on that rock forever. The trail ahead was still long, and if I didn't move soon, things would only get worse. But fear glued me in place. What if I made the wrong move, and it came after me? Just as silently as it had appeared, the figure shifted, turning away from me. My flashlight caught a glimpse of its movement, a fluid slide deeper into the trees, swallowed by shadows before I could process what was happening. It was gone, just like that. I stared at the spot where it had been, waiting to see if it would come back, but there was nothing. The forest felt even darker without it. The absence of that strange presence didn't bring relief, only a heavier sense of isolation. I tried to listen for footsteps, the crunch of leaves, anything, but there was only silence. My ankle throbbed in protest as I shifted, but the pain was secondary now. I had to move and fast before the figure returned or something else emerged from the forest. I stood slowly, using the rock to push myself up, wincing as my ankle buckled slightly. There was no time to waste wondering who or what it had been. I just needed to get out. Every step felt like a battle. The trail, which had seemed manageable earlier, now felt impossibly long. My injured ankle made each step a struggle, forcing me to limp and lean against trees for support. With every shuffle forward, the fear of being followed gnawed at me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that figure emerging from the shadows again. The trees felt closer, the darkness more oppressive, as if the forest were pressing in on me. My breathing grew shallow, every step a reminder of how vulnerable I was. But I couldn't stop, not now. I imagined the figure lurking just out of sight, waiting for me to slow down or collapse from exhaustion. That thought kept me going, even as the pain became unbearable. I pushed through the agony, forcing my body forward. The trail twisted and turned, making it impossible to know how much further I had left. I counted every step, focusing on each painful movement, hoping the end would appear soon. The forest had become a maze of darkness, and I had no choice but to navigate it alone. The moment the trees began to thin, I knew I was close. Relief flickered at the edges of my mind, though exhaustion kept me from celebrating. The pain in my ankle had become a dull throb, each step a test of willpower. But the end was in sight. I could see the clearing just beyond the last few trees, the promise of safety waiting for me. Life had always been quiet, just the way I preferred it. I lived alone in a small apartment, worked as a graphic designer, and kept to myself. I enjoyed my routines, the mornings sipping coffee, the peaceful evenings sketching or scrolling through design ideas. Nothing ever seemed out of the ordinary until the first gift arrived. It was waiting outside my door early one morning, a small brown package with no markings. I figured it was some kind of mistake. A neighbor's mail dropped off at the wrong door. When I opened it, I found a handful of vintage postcards, their edges worn and faded with age. They were strange but harmless. Each one featured scenic places I'd never visited. I didn't think much of it, setting them aside on my desk before heading to work. Over the next few days, more packages showed up, little things like old books with cracked spines and wilted flowers tied together with thin twine. There was no sender information, no return address. I assumed someone might be clearing out old belongings, maybe leaving things they didn't need for neighbors to take. A part of me found the gesture oddly thoughtful, even though the gifts seemed completely random. It wasn't until the third or fourth delivery that the unease began to creep in. The shift was subtle at first. I found an old action figure from my childhood inside one of the packages, the kind I hadn't thought about in years. It was identical to one I used to carry around everywhere as a kid. For a moment, I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe it was a common toy, one that lots of kids had back then. But the nagging sense of recognition wouldn't go away. A few days later, a small photo appeared inside the latest package of me. It wasn't an old photograph. It was recent, taken without my knowledge. I was sitting at a cafe I visit sometimes, my head slightly turned as I scrolled through my phone. My stomach tightened as I stared at the picture, trying to remember if I'd seen anyone unusual around that day. But nothing came to mind. The final straw came when I found a piece of my own clothing inside one of the packages, a shirt I had washed the night before. It was still warm, as if it had just been taken from the dryer. That's when fear really began to set in. Someone had been in my apartment, going through my things. This wasn't just some friendly gesture or harmless prank. Someone knew too much about me, and they weren't afraid to let me know. I wasn't the kind of person who liked to talk about personal problems, but I needed someone to hear me out. Megan, my coworker, was one of the few people I trusted. She was the opposite of me. Outgoing, bubbly, the kind of person who could make friends with anyone. If anyone could offer some perspective on this strange situation, it was her. During a lunch break, I told her everything about the gifts, the photo, even the shirt from my laundry. Megan listened carefully, though I could see a hint of amusement in her expression. When I finished, she smiled and shrugged. "Sounds like someone has a crush on you," she said, laughing lightly. "Bad at showing it." I wanted to believe that. I wanted to write this off as someone with awkward intentions and nothing more. But deep down I knew it wasn't that simple. Still, Megan's words gave me a small sense of reassurance, and I decided to follow her advice. If this was some weird admirer, maybe ignoring the gifts would make them stop. Ignoring the gifts didn't work. In fact, things only got worse. I changed the locks on my apartment door, installed a chain lock for extra measure, and set up security cameras in the hallway and my living room. I even bought a motion-activated alarm for the windows. It gave me a small sense of control, a way to convince myself that I could put an end to this. But the gifts kept coming. One morning I found a package waiting on my desk at work, a small ceramic figurine I used to keep in my childhood bedroom. It was impossible. I hadn't told anyone at work about the gifts, and my apartment locks had been changed. I checked the cameras obsessively that night, but the footage showed nothing. No one had been near my door, no one had left anything behind. Then, the unimaginable happened. I came home one evening to find another gift inside my apartment. The door was locked, the windows were sealed, and there were no signs of forced entry. Yet somehow, someone had left a small, neatly folded letter on my coffee table. The words on it were chilling in their simplicity. "I like being close to you." At that moment, the full weight of my situation sank in. The gifts weren't just a game or a show of affection. Someone had access to my life, my space, my routines, my thoughts. I sat down, overwhelmed, and tried to steady my breathing. No matter how many locks I changed or how many cameras I installed, they could get in. They had been inside all along. I woke up the next morning to the sound of my phone buzzing, another delivery notification. When I opened my door, I found a small package waiting for me. It was smaller than the others, wrapped carefully in plain brown paper. My stomach dropped as I unwrapped it. Inside was a simple USB drive, completely unmarked. I stood in the doorway, gripping the USB in my hand. My mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. Part of me wanted to throw it away, but curiosity gnawed at me. Maybe this was the answer I had been waiting for. Maybe it would tell me who had been sending the gifts, who had invaded my life. After hesitating for what felt like forever, I closed the door and walked over to my laptop. I plugged in the USB, feeling a knot tighten in my chest. The screen flickered briefly, and a video file opened automatically. There were no labels, no options, just a single video that began playing the moment the drive connected. At first, the video was just darkness. I thought it might be corrupted or empty. Then the image shifted, the grainy resolution sharpening into focus. My heart dropped. The screen showed my apartment, the same room I was sitting in right now, from an angle I didn't recognize. I stared at the screen, feeling cold sweat bead along my temples. The video was in real time. I could see myself, sitting at the desk, the dim light from my laptop illuminating my face. I moved slightly, and the version of me on the screen moved too. My hands began to shake as I tried to process what I was seeing. Someone had placed a camera inside my apartment. Someone was watching me at that very moment. Frantically, I scanned the room, trying to find the source. But the camera angle didn't match any of my devices. It wasn't from my laptop or my phone. It was hidden somewhere I couldn't see. I turned back to the screen, paralyzed by the realization that the intruder hadn't just been close. They had been inside my home the entire time. I stared at the screen, too afraid to move. The video felt like a trap, a game the intruder wanted me to play. They hadn't just been leaving gifts to mess with me. They were showing me that they could come and go as they pleased, that my life was something they could enter at will. I searched my mind for any memory that might explain how they had done this. I thought back to the security measures, the new locks, the cameras, the alarms. None of it had mattered. They had outmaneuvered every defense I put up. And now, with this video, they were making it clear. I had never been alone. The gifts were never just tokens, they were warnings. Each one was a step closer, a reminder that they knew more about me than anyone else. I glanced nervously around the apartment, feeling like the walls were closing in. There was nowhere to hide. Whoever they were, they had been in here, watching, waiting. The video on the screen shifted slightly, the camera lens adjusting, as if someone was moving it. My breath hitched. They weren't just recording me, they were still here, somewhere. I sat frozen, afraid that even the slightest movement would give me away, even though I knew it didn't matter. They had already seen everything. I felt exposed in a way I'd never experienced before, like every layer of safety I'd built around my life had been peeled away. The video feed remained steady, but the silence in the room was deafening. I couldn't hear anyone else, but I knew they were close. Maybe in the next room, maybe behind me, maybe waiting for me to make a move. I stared at the screen, my mind screaming at me to run, but my body refused to obey. The realization hit me hard and fast. This was the moment they had been building toward. Every gift, every intrusion was leading up to this. The video cut off suddenly, the screen going black. I sat there, the laptop's quiet hum, the only sound in the room. I had always kept to myself, the kind of person who enjoyed silence more than small talk. I lived alone, rarely spoke to my neighbors, and preferred it that way. The apartment building was a collection of quiet people. Few interactions, no friendships, and no one prying into anyone else's life. That's why Mr. Anselmo's invitation caught me off guard. He stood at his door one evening, a peculiar smile curling on his thin lips. His eyes, dark and sharp, felt too focused on me. "Why don't you come over sometime?" he asked casually, as if we'd been friends for years. I hesitated, uncomfortable with the idea. But something about the way he asked, friendly, almost insistent, made me nod in agreement before I could think better of it. I told myself it was harmless. He was just a neighbor trying to be polite. Maybe he was lonely and wanted company. I didn't have a reason to say no, though the invitation left me with a strange knot in my stomach. The following evening, I found myself standing outside Mr. Anselmo's door, feeling uneasy but too far committed to back out. He greeted me warmly, ushering me into his apartment. The space was ordinary at first glance, furniture neatly arranged, walls painted in muted tones, but there was something unsettling about it. The house felt cluttered, filled with an odd assortment of objects, everyday things like old clocks, pens, empty bottles, and picture frames. None of it made sense. The items seemed too specific, like each one had been taken from someone's personal life and placed here, out of context. It was as if the apartment were a collection of fragments from other people's lives, stitched together into an uncomfortable patchwork. Then I saw it, the wall of photographs. Dozens of faces stared back at me, arranged haphazardly on a corkboard pinned to the far wall. They were strangers, men, women, old and young. My discomfort deepened as I scanned the wall until I saw a photo that stopped me cold. It was me. There I was, standing outside my own apartment door, a photograph taken recently without my knowledge. I felt my skin crawl, my pulse quickening in my ears. The friendly visit had shifted into something far more sinister. I fought to keep my expression neutral, pretending that the photo hadn't disturbed me. My instincts told me to leave as quickly as possible. I forced a smile, mumbled something about having work early the next day, and thanked Anselmo for the invitation. He stood by the door as I stepped into the hallway, his gaze lingering too long. Just as I thought I was free, his voice followed me, quiet but deliberate. "There's so much more to see," he said with a knowing smile, as if the visit had only scratched the surface. The words clung to me as I walked away, leaving a chill in their wake. I felt his eyes on my back, following me down the hall, as if the conversation hadn't ended when I closed his door. It wasn't just a visit. It felt like the beginning of something I couldn't understand yet, something much darker. I tried to shake off the encounter, but the unease followed me home. Over the next few days, small things began to feel wrong. It started with objects appearing where they shouldn't be. An unfamiliar pen on my nightstand, a matchbook from a bar I'd never been to sitting on my kitchen counter. At first, I thought I might be forgetting things, but the objects kept coming. Each time I found something new, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The sense of intrusion was undeniable. Someone had been inside my space, moving things around, leaving traces. I started locking my doors obsessively, checking the windows twice before going to bed. But it didn't help. Then the photos began arriving. They came without warning, slipped under my door, placed on my windowsill, and left in my mailbox. Each one captured me at random moments during my day, walking to work, sitting on the bus, buying groceries. They weren't just surveillance, they were reminders that someone was always watching. The worst one came late at night. I found it on my kitchen table when I returned from the bathroom. It was a photo of me sleeping, taken from the corner of my bedroom. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at it, trying to understand how someone had gotten inside my apartment without waking me. That's when I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to confront Anselmo. The photograph of me sleeping was the last straw. Every time I closed my eyes after that night, I felt as if someone was standing in the dark, watching me. Sleep became impossible. I stayed up, pacing the apartment, jumping at every sound. My thoughts circled endlessly. How had someone gotten inside? Had I left a window open, or was there another way in that I didn't know about? I couldn't live like this. There was only one thing left to do: confront Anselmo. I had to put an end to this madness. I felt the fear knotting in my chest as I stood outside his door, but I couldn't back down. I needed answers, no matter what they were. With my heart pounding in my throat, I raised my fist and knocked on his door. The sound echoed down the empty hallway. No response. I knocked again, louder this time, and then tried the handle. It twisted easily, and the door swung open with a soft creak. The moment I stepped inside, I knew something was wrong. The apartment was completely empty. No furniture, no objects, and no photographs. The walls, once cluttered with items and pinned photographs, were now bare, stripped of everything that had been there just days ago. I wandered through the rooms, searching for any sign that Anselmo had lived here. But there was nothing. It was as if the apartment had been abandoned for years. Dust coated the floors, and the air smelled stale, as if no one had set foot inside for a long time. Panic clawed at my throat as I moved from room to room, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Had Anselmo packed up and left, or had everything I witnessed been some elaborate trick? But how could a life, an entire apartment, vanish overnight? There was no trace of the collections or the photographs. It was as if Anselmo, and everything he represented, had never existed. I stood in the middle of the empty apartment, my thoughts racing. The sense of being watched, the objects left in my home, the photos of me, none of it was random. Anselmo's collections had been more than just bizarre trinkets. They were a warning, a prelude to something darker. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as I realized the truth. Whatever had been following me hadn't left with Anselmo. His disappearance wasn't an escape. It was a signal that something much worse was still out there, waiting. Anselmo had shown me just enough to make me understand how vulnerable I was, how easily someone or something could slip into my life and take what it wanted. The objects in my apartment, the photographs, they weren't accidents. They were deliberate. They were meant to let me know that I was never truly alone. I left Anselmo's apartment, locking the door behind me as if that would keep the fear at bay. But the silence that followed me down the hall was heavy with something unseen. I hurried back to my own apartment, locking the door and sliding the deadbolt into place. It was late afternoon when I heard a knock at the door, a sound so out of place in my usually quiet apartment that it startled me. Visitors weren't common. When I opened the door, I found a man standing there with a friendly, easygoing smile. He introduced himself as Miguel, claiming to be a distant cousin I had never met before. At first, I didn't know what to say. I wasn't close with my family, and the mention of distant relatives stirred only vague memories. Yet Miguel seemed comfortable, as if his presence was the most natural thing in the world. He held a small tin of cookies and spoke warmly, recalling old family stories and saying he wanted to reconnect. Something about the situation felt strange, but I ignored it. Maybe I'd missed out on some family news, or maybe Miguel was just trying to be friendly. Part of me felt obligated to let him in. It wasn't often that anyone, let alone family, reached out. I invited him inside, telling myself it was just a short visit. Miguel began visiting more often after that. It was subtle at first. He'd drop by with small gifts, telling stories about relatives I barely remembered. His visits felt casual, almost pleasant, and I convinced myself that he was simply trying to build a relationship. After all, family ties were something I'd never really pursued. But as time passed, Miguel's presence grew harder to ignore. He stopped calling ahead, instead showing up unannounced, often at inconvenient moments. He'd stay longer each time, making himself at home in ways that made me uneasy. He knew details about me that I hadn't shared, like what I usually ate for dinner or what shows I liked to watch. I told myself he'd probably picked up those things from small talk, but it still felt off. The strangest part was how easily Miguel fit into my life, almost as if he'd always been there. He'd rearrange small objects without asking, act like he knew where things belonged, and comment on routines I hadn't realized were so predictable. Miguel's integration into my life felt seamless, but it began to erode the sense of privacy I'd carefully maintained. I started noticing things out of place, cups left in odd spots, books arranged differently. Miguel moved around my apartment with the ease of someone who had lived there for years, which made it hard to set boundaries. My friend Isabella noticed my growing discomfort. Over coffee one day, I told her about Miguel, how he'd shown up out of nowhere, how he seemed to know so much about me. She listened carefully, her brow furrowing as I described his behavior. "Be careful," she said, her voice laced with concern. "Something about this doesn't feel right." I tried to brush off her worries, feeling torn between suspicion and guilt. Miguel hadn't done anything overtly threatening, and I didn't want to alienate the only person who seemed to care about being part of my life. But Isabella's words stayed with me, stirring doubts I couldn't ignore. Miguel's behavior grew more invasive as time went on. He started showing up at odd hours, knocking on my door late at night or early in the morning, as if time didn't matter. His questions also took a strange turn, more intimate, prying into areas of my life I had never shared with anyone. "How late do you usually stay up?" he asked one evening, casually flipping through my mail as if it were his own. "What do you think about just leaving the door unlocked? You don't really need to lock it, right?" I felt a knot tighten in my chest every time he spoke, his questions digging into parts of my life I didn't want to discuss. It wasn't just curiosity. It felt like he was trying to dismantle my sense of security, piece by piece. One night, after Miguel had left, I walked through my apartment, checking every lock and window. But no matter how many times I checked, I couldn't shake the feeling that he had already found a way in. It happened late one evening. I returned home to find Miguel sitting on my living room floor, surrounded by an old photo album I hadn't looked at in years. He hadn't asked permission to take it from the closet. I hadn't even known he knew where it was. Several pictures were missing, torn out and scattered carelessly across the floor. He flipped through the remaining pages with a strange intensity, as if searching for something specific. The sight of my personal memories disrespected like that made my skin crawl. "What are you doing?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady despite the fear creeping in. Miguel glanced up, a slow, unsettling smile spreading across his face. "I've always been here, Gabriel. You're the one who forgot." His words hit me like a blow. For a moment, it felt as if the ground beneath me shifted, the air thick with meaning I couldn't grasp. I stood frozen, unable to process the weight of what he had just said. Miguel spoke as if he belonged in my life, not as a visitor or even as a relative, but as someone who had always been part of it, someone I had somehow forgotten. The room felt heavier with each passing second, suffocating in its silence. I demanded to know who Miguel really was, my voice shaking with anger and fear. But Miguel's response was nothing more than a knowing glance, a calmness that terrified me. "I've always been here," he repeated softly, like a mantra, as if that was the only explanation I needed. He stood up slowly, brushing off imaginary dust from his clothes. Without another word, he walked to the door, moving with an eerie sense of finality. I followed him, but by the time I reached the door, he was already slipping into the night. His figure dissolved into the shadows of the street outside, leaving nothing behind but the faint echo of his unsettling presence. I stood at the door for what felt like hours, staring into the darkness, trying to understand what had just happened. The next day, I tried to piece together the puzzle Miguel had left behind. I searched the apartment for any trace of him, but there was nothing. The photographs that had been ripped from the album were gone, leaving only empty spaces where moments of my life had once been captured. I asked relatives if they had ever heard of a cousin named Miguel, but no one seemed to know who I was talking about. Even the memories Miguel had shared during his visits felt slippery, as if they didn't quite belong to me. It was as though he had appeared out of nowhere, slipping into my life just long enough to create chaos before vanishing without a trace. I combed through my memories, searching for any sign that he had been real, but every detail felt distant, blurred around the edges, as if it was part of a dream I couldn't fully remember. Had Miguel been a distant cousin? Or was he something much darker, a presence that had found a way into my life by pretending to belong there? Even with Miguel gone, the fear stayed behind, lingering in every corner of my apartment. It wasn't just that he had invaded my space, it was the way he had made himself part of my life so effortlessly, as if he had always belonged there. I unlocked the door to my apartment, expecting nothing out of the ordinary. The familiar comfort of my home should have welcomed me, but something immediately felt off. It was subtle, a strange undercurrent in the air, like something had shifted while I was away. As I dropped my bag and headed toward the bedroom, my heart skipped a beat. There, lying in the center of my neatly made bed, was my wristwatch. It wasn't just any watch, it was the one I'd lost weeks ago on a trip to the coast. I remembered searching everywhere for it, eventually giving up and writing it off as gone forever. It had no business being here. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. The strap was exactly as I remembered, with the worn leather and tiny scratch on the face. I tried to tell myself I must have misplaced it at home, that I'd only thought I lost it during the trip. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. A creeping sense of discomfort settled in as I stared at the watch. How had it found its way back to me? In the days that followed, my unease grew. I tried to convince myself that the watch had been misplaced, but other strange signs began to appear. Small things, insignificant on their own, started stacking up in ways that didn't make sense. One morning, I noticed that a drawer in my desk was slightly ajar, even though I hadn't touched it in weeks. A kitchen glass was missing from the set, the empty space on the shelf glaring back at me. I checked every cabinet and drawer, but the glass was nowhere to be found. Then there was the scent, faint but unmistakable. It was cologne, a fragrance I didn't recognize, lingering in the air as if someone had just left. The strangest part was that nothing seemed stolen. My laptop, phone, and wallet were all untouched. Whoever had been inside wasn't after my belongings. They were after something else. The sense of invasion grew stronger with each passing day. It wasn't just the missing glass or the open drawer. Other objects started appearing where they shouldn't be. A book I hadn't read in months was lying open on the kitchen counter, its spine cracked, pages folded awkwardly. At first, I thought I'd left it there absent-mindedly. But as I picked it up, a slip of paper fluttered from between the pages. A handwritten note in neat, unfamiliar script. "I'll be seeing you soon." The words sent a chill down my spine. Someone had been in my apartment, going through my things, leaving breadcrumbs for me to find. I tried to shake it off, but paranoia was settling deep into my bones. I began checking the locks compulsively, testing the windows to ensure they were sealed. But no matter what I did, the feeling that someone was watching me lingered, as if my privacy had been shattered beyond repair. I couldn't live like this, waiting for the next clue, wondering what would show up next. I decided it was time to act. I changed the locks on every door, installed new deadbolts, and set up security cameras throughout the apartment. I positioned one camera to cover the living room, another in the hallway, and one near the front door. For a brief moment, I felt in control again. The cameras were my safeguard, a way to reclaim the sense of security that had slipped away. I spent hours reviewing the footage every evening, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever had been entering my apartment. But the cameras showed nothing. Day after day, the footage revealed only empty rooms, undisturbed spaces. There were no signs of forced entry, no figures lurking in the shadows, and yet the unsettling feeling never left. Whoever was toying with me knew exactly how to stay hidden. I was dealing with someone, or something, that understood the limits of my precautions, slipping through the cracks in ways I couldn't detect. It was nearly midnight when my phone buzzed, jolting me from an uneasy sleep. A notification from the security system, motion detected in the living room. Heart pounding, I grabbed my phone and opened the live feed. At first, the room looked completely normal, just the soft glow of the lamp casting faint shadows on the walls. I scanned every corner, holding my breath. The camera's feed was smooth, with no signs of movement. But then I noticed it. The watch. The same wristwatch I had found on my bed days ago, now sitting in the center of the coffee table. I stared at the screen, frozen. The watch hadn't been there before. I'd left it in my bedroom drawer. Yet somehow it was now on the coffee table, placed deliberately as if someone wanted me to find it. The camera showed no person, no movement, nothing but the watch. But it was there, proof that someone had been in my home again, and they had left behind another silent message. I sat in the dark, replaying the footage over and over, trying to make sense of it. The video showed nothing, no doors opening, no figure moving through the room, and yet the watch had appeared. It was as if the intruder existed just beyond the camera's reach, slipping in and out without leaving a trace. A cold wave of fear washed over me. I had taken every precaution, new locks, cameras, everything I could think of to protect myself. But none of it mattered. Whoever was behind this knew exactly how to avoid detection. They weren't just trespassing, they were in complete control, playing with me like a cat with a mouse. Sleep became impossible. Every creak of the apartment made me jump. Every shadow felt like it was hiding someone just out of sight. I started keeping a knife by my bed, though I knew it wouldn't do much good. The intruder didn't seem interested in hurting me, at least not yet. They wanted something else, fear. And they were getting exactly what they wanted. The days blurred into a haze of exhaustion and paranoia. I tried to go about my routine, pretending everything was fine, but I knew I was being watched. It wasn't just a feeling, it was a fact. The intruder was still there, waiting, moving things around just enough to remind me they hadn't left. Then it happened again. Another item from my past, a keychain I thought I had lost years ago, appeared in the middle of the bedroom floor. I hadn't seen it in ages, and yet, here it was, as if it had never been gone. The implications were terrifying. Whoever was inside my life knew things about me that I didn't even remember. They had access not only to my apartment, but to my past, my memories, and the things I thought were long forgotten. I stared at the keychain, knowing that it wasn't just a coincidence. It was a message, clear as day. I know everything about you. Late one night, just as I thought I couldn't take any more, my phone buzzed again, another notification from the security system. Motion detected in the hallway. I opened the feed, heart pounding. The hallway outside my apartment looked empty, bathed in the dull light from the overhead fixture. I watched for several long moments, waiting for something, anything to move. But nothing happened. The hallway remained still, silent. It started with a simple mistake. At least, that's what I told myself. The first letter showed up a few days after I moved into the apartment. It was addressed to someone named Henry Pike, not me. I figured it was just a delivery error, so I tossed it aside and forgot about it. More letters arrived over the next few days. Always the same name, Henry Pike. Each time, I planned to return them to the post office, but something always stopped me. I let them pile up on the small table by the door, where I told myself I'd deal with them later. But later never came. Curiosity got the better of me one night. I slit one open with a knife and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was blank, except for one sentence, scrawled in handwriting that seemed familiar. "You can't ignore this forever." My stomach tightened, but I brushed it off. Just a strange coincidence, I thought. I had no idea how wrong I was. The letters kept coming, and I began to open them, one by one. What I found inside chilled me to the bone. Cryptic messages, threatening notes, and strange drawings of places around the apartment complex. One sketch was of the view from my window, perfectly matching the angle of the street below. Another showed my building with tiny figures standing by each apartment door, including mine. Then the packages started arriving. I remember vividly the first one, a small brown box, heavy for its size. I opened it carefully and my breath caught. Inside was a doll, old and stained, with dark red blotches across its fabric face. A note was tucked underneath. "You're next." I sat down hard, the doll still clutched in my hand, trying to make sense of it all. Who was sending these things? Why? I thought of going to the police, but what would I say? "Hi, I got some weird mail." It sounded ridiculous even to me. Still, the sense of unease grew. I began double-checking the locks at night, pacing the apartment, convinced that someone was watching. Claire, my neighbor, noticed the change in me almost immediately. She was one of the only people I talked to in the building, a kind woman who occasionally dropped off extra groceries or chatted with me about books. But lately, she'd been stopping by more often, sensing something was off. "You're pale," she said one afternoon, handing me a container of soup. "Everything okay?" I shrugged, not wanting to explain the truth. But Claire wasn't one to be easily deterred. She spotted the stack of torn envelopes and packages on the table. "You need to throw those out," she said firmly. "You don't know where they've come from." I nodded, pretending to agree. But the truth was, I couldn't throw them away. There was something about the letters that felt personal, as if they were meant for me, even though the name on them wasn't mine. And then there were the details, things no stranger should know. The letters referenced activities I'd done recently, like what I ordered for dinner or when I went to the bookstore. Claire gave me a worried look, sensing that I wasn't taking her advice. "Be careful, Elliot," she warned before leaving. "Don't let this get in your head." But it was already too late for that. The letters had found their way inside, and I couldn't stop reading. The breaking point came with a letter that contained only 3 words: "Look under floorboards." I stared at it for a long time, heart pounding. It felt like a command, one that I knew I shouldn't follow but couldn't resist. I grabbed a screwdriver from the drawer and started prying up the boards near the living room wall. It didn't take long to find it, a notebook, old and worn, hidden beneath the wooden planks. My hands shook as I flipped through the pages. What I saw inside made my blood run cold. The entries were about me, my life. Page after page detailed events I thought were private, conversations I'd had with Claire, stories I'd written but never published, even personal thoughts I'd never spoken aloud. But the dates were all wrong. The entries started long before I'd moved into the apartment, as if someone had been watching me for years, tracking my every move. I sat back, the notebook heavy in my lap, a cold realization settling in my chest. This wasn't just random mail. It wasn't a mistake. Whoever had lived here before knew me, knew things about me no one else could know. And now, they were dragging me into their world, bit by bit. I spent hours hunched over the notebook, flipping through the pages again and again, hoping I'd missed something, some clue, some hint that this was all just an elaborate prank. But the more I read, the more I realized the terrifying truth. My life had been mapped out long before I ever set foot in this building. Events that felt spontaneous, my move to this apartment, my decision to isolate myself and focus on writing, they weren't random at all. The notebook documented it all as if someone had anticipated my every thought, my every step. I felt sick. I kept asking myself, how was this possible? How could someone know me so intimately? I tried to focus, tried to piece together what little made sense. The letters weren't just warnings, they were guiding me, pushing me toward something. I started looking at Claire differently. Her sudden concern, her insistence that I throw everything away, was she part of this too? Or was that paranoia talking? I didn't know who to trust anymore. Every time I thought about leaving, my chest tightened with a strange sensation, like the apartment itself wouldn't let me go. Something was keeping me here. The walls felt like they were pressing inward, as if the entire building was holding its breath, waiting for me to figure out what came next. The letters didn't stop. If anything, they became more disturbing. They didn't just describe what I had done, they told me what I was about to do. "You'll visit the cafe at noon," one said. And sure enough, I found myself sitting at the same cafe without realizing how I got there. Another letter told me I would try to call the police. I picked up the phone, dialed the number, but hung up before the call connected. It felt like the words on the page were directing my every move, erasing any sense of free will I thought I had. Claire became distant, her friendly demeanor fading. She no longer stopped by unannounced, and when I knocked on her door one evening, there was no answer. I asked other tenants if they'd seen her, but their faces went blank, like they had no idea who I was talking about. At night, I heard strange noises, faint footsteps above me, the low hum of a television that shouldn't have been on. Claire had told me no one lived in the apartment above, but I knew better now. Someone, or something, was there, watching. The last letter arrived without warning. It was slipped under my door in the middle of the night, and I found it waiting for me when I woke up. My hands trembled as I opened it, sensing this was the moment everything had been leading toward. The message inside was short, just a few chilling words. Welcome home. You're exactly where we wanted you to be. I stared at the letter, my mind reeling. The truth hit me all at once, a weight I couldn't escape. The letters and packages weren't accidents. They weren't meant for Henry Pike or anyone else. They were meant for me. It all made sense now. My life, my choices, my isolation. It was all orchestrated, designed to bring me to this place. The apartment wasn't just a home, it was a trap, and I had walked right into it. I glanced around the room, realizing that every detail, the peeling wallpaper, the flickering lights, the empty hallways, they were all part of the plan. I wasn't just a resident here. I was the next piece in whatever twisted game was unfolding. I tore the apartment apart, searching for answers. I ripped open every drawer, pried loose more floorboards, and scattered the remaining letters across the floor. But all I found were more messages, more drawings, all leading to the same conclusion. I belonged here. The walls closed in, suffocating me with their silence. The apartment seemed to pulse with a quiet, insidious energy, as if it were alive. I sat in the center of the chaos, surrounded by torn envelopes, opened packages, and the blood-stained doll that had marked the beginning of it all. The truth was undeniable now. There was no escape. This place had claimed me, just as it had claimed whoever came before. And now that I had taken the bait, there was no way out. I heard a faint knock at the door, but I didn't move. I knew better. Whatever was outside, waiting for me, was part of the same nightmare. I stayed where I was, listening to the creak of the floorboards above, feeling the weight of the apartment settle around me like a second skin.